Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And making the podcast what it is are Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Morning, Geoff.
Morning.
And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If this is your first time here, welcome and subscribe so that our episodes drop into your feed every single week. Coming up on the podcast today, Greene MSP, who defected from the Scottish Conservatives to the Liberal Democrats just a few days ago. Later on as well, Kenny MacAskill, the newly elected leader of the Alba party. And next week, we're bringing you a Q&A where you'll be asking Geoff and Andy anything. We're looking forward to hearing their answers on all sorts of stuff from welfare to the rise of Reform UK as well. So thanks for getting in touch with your questions. You can message anytime. You can watch us on YouTube. Just search for Holyrood Sources. And you can find us on X to watch clips. Also on TikTok. And you can hit the mailing list at holyroodsources.com. Do keep in touch on WhatsApp. The number's 0333 404 6507. Or you can email hello@holyroodsources.com. Right, we've got a bit of a guest fest for you today. We'll get to both of our guests in just the next few minutes. But shall we start, actually, guys, with a thought on Tartan Week in New York City, which have culminated in the annual Tartan Day Parade on 6th Avenue in Manhattan last weekend. This event is 27 years old. The idea is to highlight the ties between New York and Scotland. It brings in people from all over the world. Of course, First Minister John Swinney, Secretary of State for Scotland Ian Murray were among the Scottish politicians there. But it made me wonder, as I watched them tweet and as I watched the news reports, what is the point of all of this? Geoff, you've been there. What's the point of Tartan Week?
Yeah, well, you said in your opening there that it was between the really improving relations between New York and Scotland. It's not. It's North America and Scotland for a start. It was started by Jack Macdonald. I thought it was a good initiative, and actually, I'm very supportive of it. And the reason I say that is from my own experience, and perhaps it's not like this anymore. I don't know. I can't speak to that, but certainly Salmond was all about jobs and investment, and he knew that you weren't going to attract big business leaders over to Scotland on a speculative punt. But if you were willing to go out to New York and meet with them, perhaps you might get some investment decisions over the line. I mean, I remember sitting in a hotel one day with Lena Wilson, Chief Executive of Scottish Enterprise, on one side of the First Minister, and McCall, the Chief Executive of Scottish Development International. These are the two agencies directed to try and attract investment to Scotland, on either side of them. And there was about 9 meetings we had that day. I remember it really well, starting at 8 o'clock in the morning, right through till 8 o'clock at night, meeting with executives of firms and trying to get them attracted to Scotland. Obviously, some are successful, some aren't. But I remember BlackRock, a financial services institution, putting about 400 jobs in Edinburgh as a result of one of those meetings. So I think they are important for those reasons, if nothing else. Obviously, there's a bit of pomp and pageantry as well. I've got no real issue with that. But final story, just for you, quite funny when I was thinking about this, was during one Tartan Week, we'd arranged a reception in Washington, D.C., at the Capitol building, and we weren't attracting much interest from congressmen and women and senators and all the rest of it. And so I remember the First Minister phoning Sean Connery and said, listen, you wouldn't be able to help us out, Sean, and get some interest here. Anyway, Sean flew over from Bahamas to Washington, D.C., and I'm reliably informed that there has never been a more well-attended reception, and literally all these senators, congressmen and women coming out of the woodwork to get their photo taken with him. So, you've got to use every bow in your arrow. What's the string in your bow?
String in your bow.
String in your bow when you're trying to have a diplomatic charm offensive. Sean Connery certainly helped.
I like it. Andy, I suppose, with all of that in mind, this is a particularly difficult time, surely, to be in America and to be trying to kind of firm up those links between Scotland and the US, given all that Donald Trump is doing. We're thinking, of course, of tariffs right now. I do wonder if actually Tartan Week could lead to any improvement, any help in that particular context.
I mean, I think you could argue that it's more important than ever. If our goods are about to become, more expensive to the American consumer, but the market's not closed. I mean, it's not a closed market. It's just a lot more expensive. So, now more than ever, we want to persuade Americans in particular to buy our stuff, right? To buy our whiskey and buy our salmon. It's going to be more expensive for them, but now more than ever, we need to make sure they understand the value of it so they still buy it, because we still want to export to the markets. We don't want the exports to diminish too much. So, I mean, I think Tartan Day is a very good idea. I always have thought it was a good idea. What I would like to see at Tartan Day that we don't see at the moment is a bit more political cooperation rather than the political competition that always ends up being the case in Tartan Day. So so an Assarwar was there, which is good, it's fine, I think that's okay. You get others who kind of cart from the sidelines a little bit, saying it's too expensive, people shouldn't be there. Look, at the end of the day, it's pocket money. From a government budget perspective to send people to Tartan Week, and I actually would like to see politicians being part of the same team on Tartan Week that gives the message to the US in particular and to the world that says, look, it doesn't matter who's in charge in Scotland, we're all in here, and look at us all here together pulling in the same direction.
Just a quick one on that. To be fair, though, Andy, I think that's exactly what's happened this time round. Because I know that Secretary of State Ian Murray was out there, and he and John Swinney were collaborating quite heavily with Sandy Begbie of SFE. Done a few pods with us actually in terms of a global investment summit that Edinburgh's seeking to host later on this year. So there is signs in that direction, but I agree with the premise of your point. But I think there is reasonable cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Tartan Week. There we are. It should be noted as well that Holyrood is in recess at the moment for the next couple of weeks. Next week's podcast will be a Q&A with your questions answered by Geoff and Andy. So make sure you subscribe and listen out for that. Right, let's turn then to the first of two guests who you'll hear from on today's episode. We're joined by former Scottish Conservative MSP Jamie Greene, who has defected to the Scottish Liberal Democrats to become the Liberal Democrat MSP for the West of Scotland region. Jamie, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it goes out.
Yes, absolutely fair. Are you used to hearing that you're the Liberal Democrat MSP for the West of Scotland region? How does that sound?
It's only been 2 days. I'm still getting used to it. I think when you've been the whole kind of we and them and they thing, which is not a conversation about pronouns, it's actually just a genuine mark of how you refer to people, whether they're on your side or the other side. It's certainly been an eventful week since Parliament broke up for recess. That's for sure. It's been quite something. That's for sure.
Well, when you say it's been quite something, give us an insight into what it's like to defect, because I don't know how you have the first conversation with the party that you want to join. How does that go? Do you sidle up to Alex Cole-Hamilton one day in the canteen and say, "Do you know what, I'm thinking about it"? How does that process work?
I mean, there's two stages. One is coming to a conclusion that you're going to resign the whip from your current party, and that's a thought process. It's an evolution, and it's an internal one, and that's something that certainly did not happen overnight, Calum. That is a long process, and through a series of a lot of thinking, a lot of reflection, and it's just a combination of a series of thoughts, events, actions that then crystallize in your head that that's what you want to do. That's what you're going to have to do. And that's certainly what happened to me last week. What happens after that, of course, there's a number of options available to folk when they do that. And you look at all options. You look at the pros and the cons. You consider all eventualities. There are benefits to being part of a political party. There are benefits to sitting on your own. There are probably far more negatives to sitting on your own in Parliament as an independent, as I think those who've tried it have discovered. The Parliament is simply not geared up to supporting independent members or independent voices. It's very, very difficult to achieve anything as an independent in the Scottish Parliament. I think that's actually that's a problem, actually. I think it simply encourages people to just stay where they are, even if they're not happy or they don't agree with what their party is saying. Making the jump to another political party is quite rare in Scottish politics. It happens probably more often in Westminster. I think we're all quite used to some of the high-profile defections down there. And I think because it happened so rare, it perhaps became bigger news than I expected it to be on the day. So,
yeah, fair enough. I'm quite taken by what you say about the kind of independent voices part of all of this, because I think it's clear from what you've said so far, and perhaps you'll talk a bit about this, that obviously you felt like the Scottish Conservatives was no longer the party for you. That's not where you felt you belonged anymore. But the idea of being a kind of independent voice within that party also sounds like it was a jarring sort of concept for you as well. Is that is that a sort of nod to the Scottish Parliament being very tribal, that parties are sort of very dug in, that they're not perhaps as broad a church, to use the political cliche, as they might claim to be?
I think broad churches and big tents and all the stuff I've been using over the last few days is actually true. The Scottish Parliament is tribal. Let's not beat about the bush. It is designed, this idea that it was formed in a shape of an arc so that we all sit around and get on with each other and we're all constructively working with each other. That happens on occasion. But for the most part, it's all about getting the soundbite as to what's going to get you the column inches and the headlines, or who's going to get on the 6 o'clock news that night with the best line. It is designed to be adversarial. It is adversarial. It's got worse. This is my second session in Parliament. And I think, I understand that the nature of political parties, it's a coalition of people who, broadly think along the same lines, that broadly have the same policy desires and ambitions for the country. And for the most part, that holds together with glue. But the problem is when the glue starts to wear off is what happens next. Now, if you're a sort of political party that's willing to accept that and allow that is the true broad church in its true sense, and you've got people on one side of the spectrum, one side of the other, and you can get on well, and the party will accommodate that, then that's fine. I think the problem is that when people don't change but the party does, that's when the issue comes to the fore. That's what happened to me, to be quite frank. My politics haven't changed since 2016 when I was first elected, but the party's shifted. The party was slowly, gradually moving and accelerating more to the right of the spectrum for my liking, and that's when I became deeply uncomfortable about that direction of travel, Calum.
Yeah, and I think, there's, just before the guys come in, one of my immediate reactions to that is, could that, in theory, Jamie, be used as a criticism of you? Is that you haven't evolved, the party is sensing a shift in society that it needs to reflect and it needs to react to, and so it is moving, and sure, people get left behind in that, but isn't that part of how political parties have to work?
I don't make any apologies for sticking to my principles and values, actually. So, if that means I've been left behind while the party lurches to the right, then so be it. I absolutely stay true to myself and the values that I hold dear and always have done, the things that I've always fought for before and during politics. That hasn't changed. I think that, of course parties will wane and wax as the political narrative changes. The tectonic plates of Scottish politics and actually wider politics are moving under our feet. I understand you have to react to that, but the way to react to that is take people with you, take the electorate, take your membership, take your activists, take your elected representatives with you on that journey. What you can't do is ostracise them. You can't simply just move the party in one direction or the other at great speed because you're chasing after what appears to be quite dismal polling. That's a reactive way to deal with it. The way to deal with it is have an open and frank conversation about what's going wrong. Why are people leaving the party either to the left or to the right? And that's a sort of frank and honest conversation that should have been happening, instead of just chasing after these votes that are clearly going to another place.
Yeah, look, obviously I think this whole thing's pretty interesting. And I completely understand why Jamie has done what he's done. I think there's probably a short-term discussion and a long-term discussion here. I think the short-term issue is pretty obvious, is that the Tories have emerged from the 2021 election, at a pretty high watermark, and they've got that result really on the basis not of being Conservatives but of being Unionists. That was still very much an independence-focused election. It was a no to IndyRef 2 single-issue campaign, and Douglas Ross actually executed that campaign really pretty well, to be honest with you, and got the best result that the Tories have ever had at Holyrood in 2021. I think the problem now is that because of the emergence of reform, which is not the fault of the Scottish Tory party, but because of the emergence of reform and the fact that reform are effectively taking the same approach that populist parties have done all over the world, Russell Finlay has a really difficult choice, which is to chase reform and try to get some of those votes back by moving towards them, or to try and make a virtue of the fact that he's not reform and moving away into the space that still remains in Scottish politics on the sort of soft right-ish of the spectrum. And along with Kemi Badenoch, in fairness, who seems to be doing the same thing, I think it is pretty clear that he's choosing the first and not the second of those. And the difficulty the Tories have is that, I mean, we had Thomas Kerr on this podcast, 2 months ago, or so, when he left the Tories and joined Reform. This is the difficulty, in fairness, that Russell Finlay has, is he's losing people out of the door on the right-hand side of the room. He's also losing people out the door on the left-hand side of the room. And it's not that easy to manage that sort of issue. So, this is the short-term issue, is that by moving to a more populist position, he is leaving a lot of ground on that soft right of politics. And, to be fair to the Lib Dems, there's a lot of people in the Lib Dems who think, well, actually, maybe that's ground that we can fill. And the fact that somebody like Jamie is comfortable going to the Lib Dems tells you a bit of a story about that.
Andy, that's, if you look back at the last year's general election and all those blue wall seats, actually, I lived in some of those areas, Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, those nice parts of England that all consider themselves to be quite conservative places. I mean, even Whitney, that was David Cameron's old seat. He was my MP for a while when I lived there. They've all gone to the Lib Dems. So it was an easy transition for those folk to go from that place to the other place. I actually think, to be fair to Russell Finlay, he has a very difficult job. I said that to him when I spoke to him, and I said it in my letter of resignation. It's a really difficult job he's got. And I spoke to Thomas Kerr after I resigned as well. And it's interesting. I think Thomas, I'd love to have a sit-down chat with him on your podcast sometime in the future, because I think we probably both left the party for the same reason. It's just that we went to a different destination. And that to me should be a big wake-up call. If I was sitting there as head of strategy at the Scottish Conservatives right now, I would be saying, what are we doing about this loss of support? It's not Thomas and I. We are the least of the party's problems. It's all the people who are coming with us is the problem. It's the fact that my inbox is chock-a-block with people saying, do you know what? I've always voted Conservative, but I think what you've done was very difficult and very brave, and I'm gonna do the same. As a lot of folks, you're talking about donors, and that's when things get really difficult with political parties, when they start losing money. You've got activists, members, and even members of staff. I've had three private conversations with members of the Conservative group staff who are deeply uncomfortable with the direction of travel of the party and are looking for a way out. And I said to them, it's not easy. You're going to get absolutely everything chucked at you if you do this. And I will, I'll do what I can to help folk in that situation. But that's on one side of it, and the same will be true on the reform end as well. And I think that over the next 12 months, you're going to see that people will have to make a decision where they sit. Where do they sit comfortably? Do you want to sit there and let the party drift towards a reform-light agenda? And if you're not happy, what are you going to do about it? You need to find a home somewhere in politics, don't you? I mean, it's an ever-evolving journey. Your own personal political journey is always an evolution as well.
Do you know what I think the other thing is here? So, Jamie's made it clear that he wasn't very happy with the policy platform and so on, and that's completely fine. That's one side of it. But there's another reason here for people in the Tory party to think about whether or not they're in the right place, and that's about proximity to power. I mean, people get into politics because they want to get something done, because they want to be near power. The reality is, with their 4 MSPs, the Lib Dems are much more influential than the Tories with their 31. I mean, if you're looking at closeness to government, ability to make change, well, just look at the budget that happened at the back end of last year. The Lib Dems influenced that budget to quite a significant degree. A lot of discussion with the government, made a deal, got various things that they wanted. The Tories aren't in a budget discussion and they're never going to be in a budget discussion. So if you're actually wanting to go into politics to say, actually, I've got some ideas here that I think could make life better, and you want to be as close as you can to actually making it happen and as close to the government as possible, you're not going to be in the Tories, are you? You're going to be, you're going to be with the 4, now 5 Lib Dems, because they wield a lot more power than the 31 Tories do. So there is that consideration to take into account here too.
Nobody gets into politics to sit in eternal opposition. And that's what the reality of what's happening. I mean, I can't see any time in the next decade or so that the Scottish Conservatives would ever have a hope in hell of forming part of a government of Scotland. So, that leaves you in a position of what are you all about then? Are you just going to sit there in opposition and oppose everything for opposition's sake? And what does that achieve? I mean, I've always been the sort of person that's been constructive to do deals across the chamber on issues. It's how I got my Victims Bill proposals are passed at stage 2, and I hope to do the same at stage 3. Sitting in a room with people that you disagree with on the Constitution is perfectly fine. If you can hammer out a deal, if you're part of a smaller party that has more influence of power, then you'll actually get something done in politics. We all want to leave the other side of politics with your head held high, saying, I achieved something, I got something into law, I got something out of the budget, I influenced the government decision on this, that, or the next. That's actually what politics is all about. You could spend decades in opposition just moaning about everything, and what's the point of that?
I suppose, Jamie, just before Geoff comes in, on that, you say no sign in the next decade of the Tories, being close to government, leading a government. Has that changed, though? Is that feels like that you could have said that any time in the last 25 years, doesn't it, of the Scottish Conservatives?
Well, not when you're sitting after 2 consecutive elections with 31 members, which is not an insignificant amount of people. But then you have to question is what do you achieve with that 31 people? I think Andy makes a really good point. Whatever you think of the Greens, and I'll keep my comments to myself, but they got into a coalition with the government and had ministers and influenced policy and introduced legislation. Now, I disagree with much of the legislation that came out of that and some of the policies that came out of it, but nonetheless, you have a small group of people wielding a huge amount of power. Now, I think the next Holyrood election is going to be a fascinating one. I wouldn't put bets on any outcome, and the same be true probably of the 29 Westminster election. I don't see any single party having a majority in either of those parliaments. So that then means that the true plurality of Scottish politics should come into play in its own right. The Scottish Parliament should start doing what it was designed to do, and that's make people work together. Now, the question is, who's going to work with whom? Who on earth would work with reform in the next Scottish Parliament? And the direction of travel and the narrative of the Scottish Conservatives, who on earth would work with them either? So, this comes down to practicalities as well. At some point, somebody's going to have to form a government in Scotland, and the question will be is, who's best placed to do that? Who do you trust to do that?
Yeah, really interesting stuff. A few things bring to mind I'd love to tease out you, Jamie, but I was really interested in the a by-election last week held in Sutton in England, where Reform came from nowhere to win 44% of the vote at the expense of the Liberal Democrats. And it just reminded us that, they are not immune to the challenge of reform. And you kept mentioning, Reform Light in your resignation letter. You've mentioned it again here. I suppose my question is, why are people, our fellow Scots, apparently being so persuaded about what reform have to offer? And I suppose that to turn it on its head, if many of our fellow Scots are going to vote for them, do they not deserve some sort of cooperation in the Scottish Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a wider problem there, is why are people turning to a party that has very little policy with unknown candidates, but yet when they turn up at by-elections, they put a cross in the box for a party that the only thing they really know probably much about is Nigel Farage. I mean, they don't. I'm not aware that they even have a leader in Scotland, and if it is, I'm not sure who it is. I couldn't name any of the protagonists of the Reform Party in Scotland other than those that have defected. So that is an issue, and I think what that tells you is probably people are a bit scunnered with politics in general. This is not unique to Scotland or the UK. We're seeing this right across the board. We're seeing, we go back to this sort of idea of populism. Well, populism by its very nature is appealing to the populace, isn't it? I think there are lots of reasons why people will look to that, because it's not the establishment. I think the way they deliver their message is very clever. They've got a tremendous online presence, and they're very effective at getting their message out there. But also this idea that it's just angry old people voting reform, that's a nonsense. There are lots of young people that are very excited by reform, but I don't know if they know what reform stands for. But what they do see is a new movement. It's something different, it's something shiny, and it's not the establishment. And it's talking to them directly, I think, in very plain language. Now, I don't particularly like the language that they're using, and I don't particularly agree with the language they're using, but I think some people are responding to that. I think that should be a huge concern for all of the traditional political parties in Scotland. They're going to soak up votes from right across the spectrum, from the left to the right, on one side of the Constitution and on the other side of the Constitution. What that then poses a question to the mainstream political parties is, what do you do about that? How do you react to that? What is your message to people? How do you convince on a policy by policy basis that what you have to say is better than what they have to say? But we need to have that debate. It can't just simply be about anti-reform and pro-reform. I don't think, to use the word, is that very democratic? No, it isn't. the best way to defeat someone politically is to put them on a stage next to you and debate with them, and make sure that you win that argument. I've always
Yeah.
believed that.
I mean, just my own thoughts. I just feel there's such a lack of conviction in our mainstream parties just now. There's so much equivocation. There's so much on the one hand this and the one hand that. I take one example, my hobby horse on energy. I don't want to get into all the debates, but you go through all the 3-4 parties and you hear, no, we must do this. We must get decarbonized, but we can't do it at the expense of this. And we must do it. And then you just got these guys come along and say net zero nonsense, soundbite politics, and folk go, oh yeah, well, it is a lot more complex than that, the debate. Yeah. But I can understand why people say, yeah, actually, I just have no time for this. And I just feel that there's got to be a lot more honesty and transparency from our body politic right now across the established parties, and much more boldness and conviction about what you actually mean. And I think that's sorely lacking. And I think that underpins the rise of reform. Can I ask a question about you personally? I take it you are going to stand at the next election for the Liberal Democrats.
I have no idea. I haven't had that discussion. I literally just resigned the whip 5 days ago and joined another party the next day. The clues in their name, as I've discovered over the last few days, they are very democratic. They're a member-led organisation. The members of the party decide party policy. The members choose their candidates. There's no parachuting. There's no shooing. Nothing's rigged. I tell you what, it's a breath of fresh air. I've never seen anything like it. Apparently at the conference on the Saturday in the afternoon, they were choosing their policy for the next Scottish Manifesto, and that was done on a voting basis by members. I mean, I've never heard anything like it. So absolutely not. I've got no idea what I'll be doing in 12 months' time.
But is your intention to presumably put your name forward for selection?
I don't know. I don't know what seats are available. I don't know which lists they've chosen. I haven't had that conversation yet.
Okay.
I'm sure in the coming weeks I'll need to sit down with the party convener or some high heejin somewhere and say what's going on with your selections. But no, it was very clear to me, both from the top of the party, but also the grassroots that I met at the conference on Friday, that they do things their way. And a lot of those seats have been chosen, and that's the end of it. And they were quite keen to remind me of that many of those seats had been selected already. So I think that's fantastic. That's the way it should be. This idea of just dropping people in because somebody's made a big donation or something. I mean, they don't do that. They definitely don't do that. So
it's really interesting for where the Liberal Democrats find themselves, because in your part of the country, west of Scotland, they got 3.6% of the vote. Now, obviously, their polling nationally is up from that, but it's a tall order to get a seat on the list there. Because they've got 4 constituencies, they're focused on the Highlands and Islands, where they're going to have a bigger percentage of the vote, but they're not going to get an overhang seat, which is a list seat, because you've got Orkney and Shetland pretty much priced in there, which will remain Liberal Democrat. They're targeting another SNP seat. They might take the Mary Todd seat, you never know. And they've got 1 seat in Edinburgh, and we'll go 1 seat in Fife. And so it's good with the rise of reform, and it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be a bun fight between Reform, Greens, Liberal Democrats, and potentially Conservatives for these list seats beyond the Labour Party. If you accept that the SNP will win most of the constituency votes, it's going to be a real bun fight. So I put it to you, if you are to stand, you're going to have to be top of the list and then hope for a decent result in that region.
Absolutely,
your best chance.
You've got to fight for every vote. And
what I'm saying is, Jamie, it's not a career move that you've taken. It is a principled move, and I congratulate you.
I'll take that. That's the first time anybody's said that in the last week, so I'll take that. Thanks very much.
Even for your career, I can tell you that.
No, I mean, my mother was always saying, what are you doing in that Tory party? Why don't you go and join the SNP? At least you'll be a minister, and I mean, if you want to get into power. If you want to get into power, then and actually, to be fair, I mean, if the Reform Party is going to pick up 1 or 2 seats in these regions off the regional vote across Scotland, then if I was that desperate to save my career, I'd have been knocking on their door months ago, saying, chuck me at the top of the West Regional list in return for a defection. So that people and that's an option for folk to do that if they wish to. And who's to say somebody won't? Let's keep our eye on things. I think everybody was watching for the first move from the Tories to the right, but weren't really expecting to see it go the other way, perhaps. But that's not to say that the other one won't happen. There's still time. People have to make their own decisions. I mean, I just decided that in my own heart of hearts, I couldn't go on supporting the Conservative Party. It was simple as that. I mean, I woke up, many sleepless nights, and woke up one morning and knew that the time had come. And there's never a good time to do it. Obviously, we had a leadership election last year. If I did it then, I would have been accused of being sour grapes over the leadership. If you wait too long, then somebody would have said, well, you'd lost your selection meeting or whatever. So there's never an ideal time to do it. You just have to follow your heart and just get yourself ready mentally and physically to do it. Because I have to say that, some of the reactions been quite horrendous.
Do you know, Sorry, Calum.
No, after you.
It's interesting though. Just Geoff and I both get up very early in the morning as a result of children. So we've already had a bit of back and forth this morning on Lib Dem prospects. I can't remember what time that even was, Geoff, but it was a while ago. I think the interesting thing is though. So Jamie, you're right that about the Lib Dems and the way that they work and how democratic they are as a party in selecting their candidates, and that's all lovely. But actually, when it gets to the real hard stuff of making sure you've got the right people in that parliament, I think that is a bit of a deficient system. Now, you're now looking at a situation where the Lib Dems have got four, but before you came on board, 4 first past the post MSPs. As Geoff says, they didn't meet the threshold in any region to get a list MSP, but at the moment, Lib Dems in most polls are polling 8, 9, 10%. Now, it's going to be a messy election because there's going to be reform in there as well. But if the Lib Dems can hold on to that sort of vote share all around the country, then they've got a chance of picking up a regional seat everywhere. Now, if I was Alex Cole-Hamilton, I'm saying to myself, I've got to make sure that the number one person in every list around the country, or at least every list where we don't have a constituency MSP, so we've therefore got a decent chance of picking somebody up, I've got to make sure they're a really solid person. Because if I'm going to go from 4 to 8 or 10 or 12 MSPs in here, and if I want to influence budgets and be part of the process, I better damn sure make sure they're good. I can't really afford any passengers. So, I just wonder if ultimately they may regret the pure democracy of the candidate selection system at some point in the next year or so.
I think that also, but that perhaps, hold on, my dog's about to bark and go nuts because the postman's here. I think that probably underestimates the membership slightly there, Andy. But I think your strategic advice, I'm sure, will. For a small fee, it would be very welcome. I'll pass you on Alex's number, no bother at all. But I mean, you make a good point. To get to that sort of growth level, if the polls are sustainable in the way that they are at the moment, then you're going to see, it's going to be a struggle. But of course, you want a group. If you've got a small group of people, then you need to make sure that group is aligned and that they're going to be able to deliver for you. As I said, I haven't had that conversation, but we'll have a look at it. I mean, I've got no idea what those numbers, when you actually start to crunch them from a psephological point of view, what that looks like prospect wise. But I think there's a bit of work to be done there to see. I mean, at the end of the day, people have to go out and fight the fight. But I think what's interesting, it goes back to that point we made at the beginning, is that if the Conservative Party is splintering and people are voters, I mean, Conservative voters, bear in mind, many of them were first or second time voters in the 2016 and the 21 election. If we get to a situation where they're not comfortable with putting their cross in that Tory vote, that lend me your vote, the peach vote strategy, if they get to a position where they go to the ballot box and they feel like they can no longer do that, that poses a massive problem. Some of those people will put the cross in the Reform box. I think some of them will put the cross in the Lib Dem or even the Labour boxes, because it's still they're still pro-union parties to an extent. So it's an easier transition for them. Of course, we never know what people are going to do till they get to the ballot box. So, but I've definitely had conversations with a number of Conservative voters who said, I gave them my vote, I lent them my vote, but I wouldn't do it again.
Just a sort of by way of conclusion then, Jamie, it's really fascinating to explore these issues with you, and we'll watch what you get up to as a Lib Dem MSP over the next year up to the election as well. We've talked a lot about the Scottish Conservative Party, and I suppose your defection has brought a new spotlight onto their condition. What do you think the Scottish Conservatives will look like by the 2026 campaign? Will there be 30 MSPs trying to hold on to their seats? Will more have defected? I'm just trying to get an understanding of whether we are seeing the disintegration of the Scottish Conservative Party.
I hope that isn't the case, and I know that's going to sound weird, because I think all political parties have good people in them, and I would say about a dozen former colleagues have been in touch with me to reach out the hand of friendship, and I really appreciate that. They're good people with good ideas. There's a lot of experience in the party. Some of those people with good ideas are stepping down, unfortunately. I think the party I think the leadership of the Scottish Conservative has a massive challenge on its hands. How do you stop hemorrhaging people to the right and the left, and what is going to be left? I wouldn't put any predictions on it. I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know if anyone else is thinking about stepping aside from the whip, and if they did, what they would do thereafter. There are a lot of folk there who are thinking that they can get back and get re-elected, but in no poll that I've seen in the last 12 months do 30 of my colleagues come back, former colleagues. It's not going to happen. So people are going to have to make a decision and a choice. They're going to have to do a bit of soul searching and think, what am I going to do in my last year in politics? If this is your last year in politics, am I going to sit there comfortably, knowing what's coming down the line, or am I going to do something about it?
And so, can Russell Finlay be the solution if he's part of the problem?
Well, I mean, that's up to them. I mean, I think, if you're losing people, you're losing very, decent councillors to reform, and who knows, you'll see an MSP go there too. If you're losing people, activists, voters, and an MSP to the Lib Dems or anywhere else, or if you even get one or two, deciding to step back the whip and sit as independents, to me, that sums up a much bigger problem. What should be happening is somebody in central office should be saying, what is going on here? Is there a problem? Is there actually any truth in what has been said in these resignation letters? Because if the answer to that is yes, and you just ignore it and pretend that these people are just troublemakers and they're just mavericks and it's good riddance and goodbye, which is pretty much all I've had for the last 5 days, then I think they're missing the point. Now, I know for a fact there are very good people in the Conservative group who absolutely agree with what I've said, and I know that because they've told me so. They phoned me up and said, I agree with everything in your letter, but they're just not willing to do that publicly, and I respect why they wouldn't want to do that. It's a career-ending thing to say. I learned that the hard way, but sometimes you just got to say it as it is.
Jamie, really fascinating speaking to you. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
This is the Holyrood Sources podcast. Thanks so much for being with us today. Right, let's welcome Kenny MacAskill, the newly elected leader of the Alba party. Kenny, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, good morning. Thank you.
How are you feeling? How's the first couple of weeks of leadership been? Do you feel like you've got a grip on the party, that you've set a direction for the party? What is it?
Well, I think the party's in good heart. We were obviously stunned, as indeed was the country, by Alec's tragic passing back last October. But we continued, we kept the show on the road. We've had a very successful conference. We've had our first meeting of the new NEC. So the new team, the new leadership is going forward. And we're building on a very substantial legacy that Alec left to take forward the message.
What word would you use to describe the leadership contest? Because the one that I found most in the coverage was fractious. It was a fractious contest. Would you use that word? Would you use a different word?
No, I mean, I've been involved in contests, both electoral, internal and indeed external, since 1982. This was far from rumbustious. I think it was different from others, but at the end of the day, these things are said or happen in every contest. It's been minor to some of the elections I've been through.
Yeah, I suppose politicians always say that, though, don't they, Kenny? That's just a way out of something that was difficult. There was allegations of bullying and harassment and difficulty within all of this.
Well, that was certainly left field, but that was a matter. We were obviously constrained by legal advice at the time, but the National Executive Committee has dismissed for gross misconduct the previous General Secretary. That's a matter of public record. That was following legal guidance, and I stand by that decision. I didn't actually make that decision because I recused myself as was felt appropriate.
Yeah, okay. I suppose then we come on to where you are as a party. So at the general election last year, there were 19 candidates for the Alba party, winning a combined 11,784 votes. You've got a year to go, just over, till the next Scottish parliamentary election. Realistically, will Alba have electoral success at Holyrood this time next year?
I think we'll break through, and you're right, correct. The elections that we've contested have not been successful, but this strategy is predicated on a strategy that was prepared by ALEC for 2021. That would have allowed for Alba to be elected in the list to have created a supermajority, as it was for a variety of factors, the backdrop of COVID, the hostility of Nicola Sturgeon, the overhang of the court case that ALEC had sadly faced. All have meant that Alba didn't break through. Had Alba broken through, then Scotland would be in a better place. I don't think we would have had the Butte House Agreement, the SNP Green coalition, and all the tragedy there. And I think what we're also realising is that movement of the Yes movement, the independence movement, that's been rather gone, off the boil. People have put their feet up. Others have decided that it wasn't coming, and basically there's other things to do with their time. As spring is coming back, there's a spring coming back in the step of the independence movement. They are not satisfied with what's been delivered in Holyrood at the present moment, and I think Alba offer that opportunity, and that's why a vote for Alba on the list is a vote for independence, and I think the independence movement is beginning to take that on board and to recognise that.
So Kenny, can I ask about the strategy you suggested? It was that the same one that ALEC adopted in 2021, which is essentially saying to the SNP voters, don't waste your vote on the list because they ain't going to get any list votes if current polling trajectory is going to be realised. So one thing I do think you have in your favour in that respect is the personality is no longer there. ALEC is tragically no longer with us. Nicola's taken a career decision to move and to step down from politics. So without those two personalities and the well-documented rivalry, for want of a better word, there, gone, do you anticipate getting a better response from John Swinney?
I don't necessarily expect to get a better response from the SNP leadership. I think the SNP leadership will always argue for SNP1 and SNP2. That's a vested interest for those that are candidates there, and indeed lingering perhaps hostility to Alba. But I think there's three sections that we could go for. First of all, there is the independence support that in the main does vote to the SNP, but who recognise, as you say, that on the D'Hondt system, a vote for the SNP is actually just going to return unionists on the list. That's the first aspect, probably the main aspect, but there's also a section of society now, almost a third it would appear, of independent supporters who don't support the SNP, some of whom are looking for a home, some of whom might not vote unless they can be persuaded, if you don't want to vote in the constituency, at least vote for Alba for independence on the list. And there's also a third section, people who have tried Labour, tried the SNP, gone back to Labour, who are dissatisfied, not perhaps necessarily committed to independence, most certainly not committed to reform, dissatisfied with the establishment, and who are looking for something perhaps more radical and continuing the drive that they believe is necessary. So I think it's those three sections: SNP, independent supporters who are not SNP, and a radical version of society who want to see Scotland improve, because the tragedy in Scotland is we're under-delivering and yet have huge opportunities.
Yeah, can I just have one quick follow-up before Andy, I'm sure, will come in? But I thought one of your speeches recently, and I paraphrase slightly, but you kind of intimated that we can't just be seen as, criticising the SNP all the time. And I thought that was actually quite sensible, because fundamentally, if you're to attract people to vote SNP on constituency and then Alba on the list, you need to have better relations, or at least seemingly being a more accommodating towards that scenario. So is that going to be a feature of your leadership? Are you going to be more constructive in criticism, perhaps, and actually keep your troops in line on that strategy?
Yes, I think so. I think the situation, ALEC always tried to do that. It was obviously poisoned to some extent by the events related to Nicola Sturgeon. But I think, the position that I adopt is I've still got many good friends in the SNP. I disagree, with the leadership on many issues that they've taken. I recognise the good things they've done. The Scottish Child Payment is praised by me. It's praised more importantly by Danny Dorling. There are issues, though, that fundamentally they have to accept ownership of. The failure on the ferries, other aspects, the failure on the ScotWind sell-off, the failure to deliver, for our oil and gas sector, and indeed to maximise the renewable benefits. So we'll challenge on issues. But at the end of the day, we're an independence party, we're an independence movement, and we will always support, another independence party when we're not available. You might say that they're our B team, we're our A team, but, we accept the right to criticise them, and that will remain. But I do know that there have been some who have been in independence and are in the independence movement who now have huge hostility towards the SNP. I don't think that serves anyone any benefit. There are good people there. We have to work together. You have the right to challenge, but at the end of the day, there's far more that unites us than divides us.
Kenny, just on this particular theme, I want to put this question to you from Elaine in Dumbarton, one of our listeners, who says, a question for Kenny. Since there are far more folk who support independence than support the SNP, do you think it would be wise for the SNP to reach an agreement with all other indie supporting parties to field candidates on the list? Elaine says, voting SNP 1 and 2 makes no sense. However, what's the option for indie voters if the SNP don't sign up to this? Many independent supporters, including me, says Elaine, couldn't bring themselves to vote SNP if they haven't reached an agreement with other parties.
Yes, I agree with Elaine. I mean, this is an offer that we've made before at previous elections and would still stand. At the end of the day, if we can unite the movement, if we can agree, and it's not just the SNP, there are other, parties and indeed others who are not in any party. So I think Elaine is right. But as with previous instances, the SNP have refused that. We will try again. But I think what Elaine is directing is the correct way to go. But if the SNP don't, then our position remains that the list vote should certainly go for Alba.
Yeah, look, this is all really interesting. I think that the bit I can't get my head round, to be honest, Kenny, is that there seems to me to be a disconnect between theory and practice, for want of better words. In that, all you say about the third of independent supporters who don't like the SNP at the moment, there's a lot of logic to all of this, but none of that logic is showing through in any polling. So other than Norstat polling, which tends to overstate independence and independence party support more than others, there is no poll that records Alba getting any seats at all, not a single seat. And so, whilst in theory this all sounds sensible and realistic, there's just no translation into it at all. And if I look back to 2021, when obviously Alex stood on an Alba ticket in his home patch of the North East, and you think to yourself, look, if Alec can't win that seat in the North East for Alba at a time when he's still able to juxtapose against Nicola Sturgeon, then how does Alba win a seat now when the juxtaposition is no longer Nicola Sturgeon, it's now John Swinney? And when a lot of the tensions, the sort of Salmond Sturgeon tensions, are obviously for tragic reasons no longer quite the same as they were before. I can't see how you get from the position you're in right now, which is polling for 0 seats, into anything at all. I freely admit I might be missing something, but for me it doesn't look like it can work.
I think if you look at the polls, you're quite right, and I don't disagree with that, and we haven't broken through. But I think, as you say, the logic is there. The logic is impeccable. The 3 sections that we are seeking to attract, the SNP voter who wants to see independence, then don't waste your vote in the list. The independence voter who won't support SNP, well, use your vote for us, and indeed the radical voter. And I think, I've been in politics long enough to realise that sometimes you just have to persevere. I was in politics along with Alec, in the late 70s, because we came into the 80s when it seemed that Labour could only ever get higher in terms of votes, that the collapse would never come, and then it came. I've lived through the SNP seemingly impregnable with 56, and then, facing collapse last year. So things can change and can change quickly, and I believe that the independence movement is still there. It is coming back together, and, society has been changed by COVID, but it's coming out of its atomisation, and that's why I actually believe, although it's still, going to be a long march, I think it's going to be a different political scenario and indeed environment next May.
Can I ask you one question, Kenny? I'm really interested in your views on this because I haven't quite myself worked out what's going on here. If you look UK-wide, everybody is suffering from reform. There was a by-election last week, I think it might have been the one that Geoff mentioned earlier in the podcast actually, where reform actually dismantled the Lib Dems, which is something that nobody's really talked about much before at all. I mean, we know they're taking votes from the Tories and Labour, but they completely filleted the Lib Dems in that by-election down south last week as well. What doesn't seem to be happening is that reform does not seem to be hurting the SNP. And that's why I'm interested in the third cohort you talked about, the sort of radical cohort, I suppose a kind of scunnered cohort, I suppose you might say. Even though they are nationalists, do you think they are vulnerable to going to reform? Or do you think that territory is open for Alba because they will not vote for the Reform Party?
Well, I think there's two things. First of all, the SNP vote, they've been winning council by-elections, but we've been council by-elections with a turnout of 18, 19, 20, 22%. The fact of the matter is most people are not voting. Are there independence supporters, whether they vote SNP or, as Elaine, aren't prepared to vote SNP anymore, who are dallying with reform? There's a few on the margins. I don't think it's a huge section, but there will be some who are totally alienated and oppose the party. So I think the role of, Alba is to galvanise the independence vote. It's not to galvanise those who are contemplating voting for reform. I think that's a different section. I think it's to get the independence vote. And that independence vote has primarily not been turning out. It's sat at home. It's not prepared to go to the ballot box. And that's why we have to give them a reason to go to the ballot box, whether to vote SNP 1 Alba 2 or whether just to vote Alba 2. That's what we mobilise. Will some go on the margins to reform? Yeah, I think there will be some, but in the main, I think, the Reform Party is drawing in a well, from my own canvassing, of people who weren't, in the 2014 right through independence campaign. They're just sadly disillusioned. They feel let down. They just feel nothing's happening. And our job is to mobilise and motivate them.
Kenny, I have an almost unique situation here where I'm going to turn to Geoff on the podcast to get his take on working with you. This has only happened a handful of times before where we're able to do this. So, Geoff, what was it like working with Kenny? Give us a report card.
Yeah, well, I'll come to that in a second. Just to kind of tally off that conversation that Andy and Kenny were having. I think if we accept that this is going to be a rainbow parliament post election, and we know that Reform are going to be entering the fray on the unionist side of things and taking seats or percentage of vote from all other parties, then there might just be an opportunity for Alba to play into that and actually accentuate that idea on the independent side. So there might be a route through there. It's going to be a tall order, but I can see if there's a genuine feeling amongst the electorate that we want something completely different. Perhaps Alba could play into that. Yeah, working with Kenny. Look, I'll be honest with you guys. This is why I find these conversations sometimes quite difficult. I'm speaking to Kenny, who's the leader of Alba, just as I spoke to Alex Salmond, the leader of Alba. Now, I worked for the SNP and worked alongside both of these people for many years, successful years in government, and I just, alongside John Swinney, alongside Nicola Sturgeon, I've always found this quite a difficult square to circle. So, but working with Kenny, there has to be one moment, Kenny, more than any other, and that was the release of McGrahy.
Right.
And I mean, my word, we were a minority government. We released McGrahy. The world's media just went into a tailspin, particularly the American media. I think I've said before, Kenny, that you had to be interviewed by Wolf Blitzer on CNN. But there's one story I always remember. This is McGrahy had left the Scottish airspace, landed in Tripoli airport, got a phone call from Alex Salmond saying, "Geoff, they're waving saltires." In Tripoli Airport, to which an emergency call between myself, Kenny, Kevin Pringle, and Alec said, "We didn't expect this, did we?" It looked like a bloody Scotland home game. And I suppose the ability for us to not just withstand that pressure, it was extraordinary pressure, and then come out at the end of it in 2011 and win a majority was quite something, because I think folk thought that was the end of us in government at that time. That was a memory I will never, ever forget.
No, I always remember. I mean, it was 2015 that I realised that although the saltires had been on the plane, we don't know where they came from, the supposed hero's welcome that McGrahy got at Tripoli did not take place. It was camera footage that was spliced, and that came out of WikiLeaks and a book written by Ethan Cohen, who was the secretary, who was the US State Department's representative in Tripoli. And what they did was there was a gathering in Tahrir Square in central Libya that was cheered cheering Libya Independence Day or whatever, entirely separate from the airport, did not know that the airport had Megrahi coming back. And they spliced the footage and went together. Britain knew that. The USA knew that. We didn't know that, so we were apologising that this had happened, that they knew it. Because I always wondered why the former UK ambassador said, look, there's nothing really untoward in the reception. This was normal. The Libyan football team would get that. But they actually took two separate items, put them together. Gordon Brown and the UK government have never apologised for saying how dreadful it was when they were perfectly aware that there was no hero's welcome.
I had no idea.
Right.
I had no idea.
It's in Cohen's book, Return of the Colonel, whatever, and it came out in WikiLeaks. It was about 20 miles away. Something. It would be the equivalent of landing at Prestwick or at Edinburgh Airport and something taking place in George Square in Edinburgh. They did not. They were two separate matters, entirely unrelated.
Wow. There you go. But you remember the phone? There was a phone call about it at the time, though, Kenny, between the three of you that Geoff was. So you at the time you were under the impression that was what was happening. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I was falling as it was then. I forgot what you call them, Blackberries. That was it. The Blackberry was going ballistic, not with messages from Alec. But no, we regretted that because it actually came out from the guy Cohen, because it wasn't that just we had said to the Libyans, look, don't have any celebrations. The Americans said you better not have any celebrations, and Cohen admits that his comments back through the State Department that came out in WikiLeaks were all, well, they pushed the boat out, but they didn't breach, their undertaking. There's nothing we can do about them. Equally, I have to say, having written that book back in 2015, as we come towards the trial of Masood, who I predicted was the bomber, that's now going to be dealt with.
Very interesting.
My dog has just come in. That was it.
No, that's not.
There's not a ghost in the MacAskill episode.
No, YouTube. It won't be good for the podcast listeners, but YouTube viewers will know that.
It's not the CIA picking up on our conversation.
It's the famous swinging open door behind the sofa only ever means the dog, as I know very well to my cost from here.
We are. Well, Kenny, for any number of reasons, it's been fascinating speaking to you. Thank you ever so much. Thanks for taking the time.
You're very welcome. Good to speak to you.
We'll speak again soon, I hope.